Now, yes. Dr. Farrell, welcome to another episode of our dialogues. We are gathered here to witness the birth of a new member of our team. The only thing I'm worried about, though, is it has these potentially violent tendencies that I can't seem to... Well, welcome to the birth of intelligent machines. So
just what I want.
I know, Dr. Farrell, they're coming for you as an email attachment, first and foremost. I've been reading this book, Dr. Farrell, by Cormac McCarthy called The Road, and many of your readers will be familiar with it. Cormac McCarthy did Blood Meridian and a couple of other books that are noted in popular media from having been made into movies that are incredibly violent. And of course, The Road is an incredibly violent film. It's an post-apocalyptic film. And I've seen the film, and I'm about halfway through the book, and I have to say that the book is nothing like my experience with the film. Now I want to go back and watch the film, but the book is a very lyrical work, a thing of surpassing beauty and kindness and generosity. And of course, the film really plays up, aspects of it that are scary as hell, involve, meat cleavers and things like that. So that stuff is in the book, but in a much different context and a different way. But the premise of The Road, this modern novel that is probably destined to become, well, I think at least the author is destined to become one of our modern classicists. That's probably the wrong word, but writer of modern classics. Is the premise is a post-apocalyptic environment where there's essentially nothing left. So all the trees are sort of, and the plants are rotten to the root. They're falling over black. The sky is black. The ash is blowing across the land. Throughout the book, there's no electricity. There's no such thing as a company. There's no such thing as a store. Everything is gone. And the man and the boy are pushing around a shopping cart, and lucky to have that. And the boy is sort of saying, are there such things as cars anymore? And the man is going, no, there are no cars. There's nothing to run the cars on. There's nothing left, right? People have burned the tires for fuel, and there's just, everything is gone. So it's one of those environments that you could only equate with absolute, like fourth world poverty, where a fingernail might be food, and you'd be lucky to, put together a couple of sticks for tools. And so you're left picking up cans and things like that. And it's a pretty bleak environment. And it's in that environment that, of course, it's the setting for this story that's about love and human companionship and self-sacrifice and stuff like that. So it's great work. But at the same time that I'm going through this book, an article came out in New York Magazine. And the article is about, I think I'm doing parts of the show out of order. I'm a little bit tired. But the article, so I may have to switch gears because I started off with my drill and going down the path of artificial intelligence. But the article in the New York Magazine is about the environment, more particularly about climate change. And it sort of does away with the debate about causes and things like that. Is this human cause? Is this a natural cause? And it sort of takes the approach that it doesn't really matter. The fact is a giant 13-mile piece of the Arctic ice shelf just broke off and is now a free-floating, melting iceberg, one of the largest in history, that is going to potentially put twice as much carbon into the atmosphere as humans could, which may doom us anyway, while we debate about how it got that way. And it details a series of major changes that are sort of on their way, and that are probably not reversible. And sort of the subtext of the article is, how long will it take for us to experience the first losses of significant visual losses, like Miami, from climate change, and it says sooner than you think. And the premise is sort of basically, kids have been born who are going to see the loss of Miami and Bangladesh, and the Marshall Islands are coming a lot sooner than that, and so on. So reading this was an interesting premise for the show. It's an article I recommend. We will provide the link to our readers. And then the other thing I read and went in depth on is this bit about Elon Musk and his warnings about artificial intelligence. And I was sort of building a show out of this and synthesizing, this odd thing that you're hearing, which is this Silicon Valley guru saying, this is scary as hell, this is coming, we should be really worried. He compared AI developers to people summoning demons. He conjured up the risk of an AI arms race. And he's been doing this for several years now, but he's made some, recent statements this month about it. The phrase that he's using is that artificial intelligence poses an existential risk. So in essence, he's describing an apocalypse of humankind on a scale that the book is dealing with, and on a scale that New York Magazine is talking about with regard to the Earth heating up. So our show today is a bit bleak, and I have poured myself a full flask of scotch, and I want to ask you a lot of questions about this stuff. So I'm going to start with artificial intelligence. So I'm going to do a quick bullet point set of some of the things that Elon Musk is about and has said. So Elon Musk is arguing that we need precautionary, proactive government intervention. He says that by the time we develop AI and reach the point that we can regulate it, it'll be too late. And he's taken a lot of flack from a lot of other people that say, well, with any other technology, you don't, have regulations in place before you even know how the technology works. They tried to regulate social media. That didn't work out real well. Who regulated the Wright brothers? First, we built airplanes, and then we had sort of problems, and then we figured out what we needed to regulate. But Musk would make the argument that by the time you get to the place where you're having the kind of harm come from it that needs regulation, it's too late anyway. There's no one left to regulate. So he's saying this is like nuclear weapons on a mass level. You need to kind of regulate it now. So that's the second point, is he's taken some flack for that, but he's saying that people should be afraid. And that's an odd thing coming from a sort of neoliberal or left wing or progressivist Silicon Valley point of view, or even a moderate point of view, sort of fear mongering and saying, be afraid, be very afraid. So he's taken a lot of flack for that too. And some people say he's grandstanding. And meanwhile, he's developed his own company called OpenAI. And some people believe that he's making this argument in order to siphon off talent and attract attention around his company. But what his company is doing is attempting to say we need to make artificial intelligence open source. I think it's partly to bypass intelligence co-opting of private corporate development. But what he's saying, the first insistence in getting OpenAI off the ground is that it have an ethics board and that it have a doctrine of ethics around artificial intelligence. So in 2014, he likened AI developers to people summoning demons. And his point is, in every instance where you got a guy with a pentagram and he's calling up Baphomet or something like that, in those comics, he thinks he can control the demon. And of course, it always gets out of control, as our mythos goes. And in 2015, he signed a letter of warning about the risk of an AI arms race. And he talked about autonomous weapons are ideal for such tasks as assassinations, destabilizing nations, subduing populations, and selectively killing a particular ethnic group, but not much else. And he says, we therefore believe that a military arms race would not be beneficial to humanity. And this is part of a letter signed by him, Stephen Hawking, Steve Wozniak, co-developer of Apple, and a bunch of other such people. And the letter goes on to say the stakes are high and autonomous weapons have been described as the third revolution in warfare after gunpowder and nuclear arms. So they're basically saying we don't want this. And then Musk earlier this year was written about in a lengthy Vanity Fair article, which I'll also provide as a link to to listeners, and it was called A Crusade to Stop the AI Apocalypse.
Right.
So I'll stop there and just say that here we have, a person that co-developed PayPal along with Peter Thiel, is very well respected and known in both the world of Silicon Valley billionaires, but also in the world of sort of forward-thinking futurist type people. He's responsible for rethinking sort of electric infrastructure, electric cars and electric planes. He's responsible for obviously the Tesla race car. And he's thinking about how we get to Mars. That's one of his other major missions, is how do we get off this planet and build habitable places elsewhere? And here he is saying, hold your horses. You need to really think about the potential for an apocalypse brought on by AI. Mm-hmm. And so I'll stop there and just ask you, Dr. Farrell, what do you make of this so far?
Well, AI, oops, I'm getting feedback.
I'm going to mute, don't worry.
AI has been a concern of mine, a concern of Catherine Fitz, and it's been a concern that a lot of our members have had. We've discussed it many times in the vid chat. I'm going to crawl way out, as I usually do, onto the end of the twig and speculate far beyond the ability of the twig to support the weight of speculation. My concern, Daniel, is that a certain limited amount of AI is already here. And the reason I say that is because one of the things I've been watching for ever since 2010, when we had that infamous flash crash on the stock market. I don't remember the exact day. And it was, if I remember correctly, it was simply Procter & Gamble stock that was the subject of that particular flash crash, but within a matter of very, very few seconds, the value of the stock, pardon me, absolutely plummeted. And I remember that day because you could hear the broadcasts of the people broadcasting what the market was doing, and then all of a sudden they just absolutely go hysterical as they're watching this cliff in stock prices just absolutely dropping off the cliff. And then within a few seconds it began to come back. And the excuse at the time was that this was all being placed through a Kansas City brokerage. I don't remember the exact name of the brokerage right off the top of my head. And I started reading the explanations for that particular flash crash, and none of them made much sense to me. It looked as if the system had been either taken over externally or just simply on its own went nuts, because it was hard to envision that amount of humanly placed trades. And that for me is the key right there. We've been dealing for so many years, since the late 1980s really, with markets that are being driven by high-frequency trading algorithms, the so-called dark pools. And we've seen just in this last week a few more flash crashes. We saw a flash crash in the NASDAQ, which actually triggered the stop trade algorithm, and then everything had to be reset, and they reset several stock prices, from what I can tell from the stories, lower than what would have been the case had trading continued normally. Now, what this signals to me, Daniel, is that our markets, and incidentally, there was within a day, I think, or maybe even the same day, there was a crash in the commodities markets in silver. What this is signaling to me is that our markets now are so divorced from any actual human trading that they're not connected anymore to human market reality. And this is, Catherine Fitz and I have been following this, and it looks this way to both of us. And I'm beginning to think that this is something that may be signaling that a very simplistic kind of AI is already here, because we have these market events constantly being triggered, and the frequency, what is kind of concerning to me. And I was a bit mystified that Elon Musk has not caught on to this in all of his talks about artificial intelligence, that he has not looked at the actual markets themselves and how they're being driven by artificial trading algorithms that are totally disconnected from human decision making. This is a big concern to me. If you and I were to buy stocks, we'd probably go and pick up a Standard & Poor's manual, look at the cash flow, look at the assets, look at the liabilities, look at the risk of the corporation, and so on and so forth, and then we'd place a trade with a broker. That's the way we do it. But unfortunately, most trades are no longer being driven by human decision making, and I think that's a huge problem right there. So it looks to me as if we're dealing with a simplistic form of AI already. Musk intrigues me in that he's probably the only one out there talking about the dangers of AI. And what really intrigued me was, you mentioned his 2014 statements. I even remember writing a blog about that, and we talked about it in the vid chat. He was saying things like conjuring demons, and I think he meant that quite literally. I don't think he was just using a rhetorical figure of speech there. I think this is real for him in as spiritual a way that someone like him can think. And what intrigued me about it was that if you look at the descriptions of Lucifer himself in the book of Ezekiel, there's that very famous passage. I even wrote a paper on it in the members area. There's that very famous passage where it says, "Thy tabrets and pipes were made perfect in thee." Talks about Lucifer's crown being, composed of various crystals and gems and so on. And there's two ways you can look at that. Tabrets are an ancient term for a membrane. Pipes are rather obvious. You could look at that as being a description of an actual organic life form, or you could look at that as a description of a machine, an AI. And I'm getting the feeling from, looking and connecting all these dots, that the danger may be closer. I'm going way further out on the limb than Elon Musk is. I think the danger is much closer than even Elon Musk is talking about. I think some form of it's already here. The other thing I think we have to look at is CERN. CERN just recently came out and announced that they are introducing an artificial intelligence to manage their cybersecurity at CERN. And I can understand that. Because CERN is the largest user of the internet. If you're going to spread malware or hack into the internet and try and probe its architecture and so on and so forth, CERN would be a logical target for anyone of that sophistication to choose. But what concerns me about this is that they're admitting to the deployment of an artificial intelligence. We don't know how sophisticated it is. But given the fact that they have so much money at their disposal, not to mention so much computing power at their disposal, this is a concern. And the final thing that I want to connect here into your thinking is I think it was about 3 to 4 weeks ago, I don't remember the exact time frame, there was an article that appeared on the internet that came, I believe, from Google, where they had been testing their latest artificial intelligence algorithms. And apparently, this algorithm began to create its own computer language. In other words, it began to modify its programming by itself. Now, that is, to me, rather concerning, because look what you have when you put all of this together. You have markets now that are no longer reflective of actual human decision-making and pricing. In other words, we can no longer tell what the market reality is because we're one step removed from evaluating the health of an equity or the commodities market and the risks associated with it. So the point I'm making here is that price is no longer a valid mechanism for determining the actual market status of a corporation. And that, to me, is very concerning. The markets are not reflective of any human reality. And if you dig hard enough, you'll find the quants, the so-called econophysicists, the people that designed these systems, admitting that they no longer completely understand what's going on in these dark pools, these high-frequency trading systems. The other thing to look at in that connection, as I said, you've got AI already modifying programming, creating its own programming languages, albeit very simplistic stuff, but nonetheless, it's happening. So in other words, I think, I think it needs to be done. The problem here is when Musk is talking about regulation and talking about an arms race in artificial intelligence, if you're going to successfully regulate artificial intelligence and do so in a way that prohibits that sort of thing from occurring, you pretty much have to have an international effort to do it. Now, I suspect if everything I've said is the case, continuing my wild high-octane speculation here, I suspect that if you look at what China and Russia are doing in terms of trying to place into existence an alternative international financial clearing system, and in China's case, relying on quantum entanglement to do it, and there's some severe limits as we're learning, but I think this is what they're trying to do. I think it's precisely because one of the things they're concerned about is artificial intelligence perhaps taking over the financial clearing system. Fortunately, that has not happened, but I think it's here. I think it's going to grow. I think that the way to unplug it now is to get off of these artificial trading algorithms in the financial markets, in the bourses, in the stock exchanges, in the commodities markets, and get back to people hollering in the pit and exchanging pieces of paper, because at least you're dealing with something there that is a human transaction occurring in human time frames, not in picoseconds, where a computer can take down an entire stock and everything has to be reset. And again, and I'm belaboring this point, I know, but I want to make sure that people understand it. If you have to reset a market because of a so-called glitch in the trading algorithm, then you've just essentially lost a day's trade. So in other words, you're not even doing anything that's labor or cost efficient in the long run. So I think they need to reevaluate all of this stuff. I'm totally agreed with Musk. I think this is a huge danger. My disagreement with him, Daniel, is I think to a certain extent it's already here.
Well, I think that most AI people believe that AI is here, but it is how you define AI. So,
right.
We think of, if you just compare the concepts of artificial versus autonomous, a Google algorithm is a form of artificial intelligence.
Right.
A circuit that can play chess with us is a form of artificial intelligence.
Right.
But, can the thing operate autonomously from further human interaction? And there's arguably very little that is autonomous yet, but it isn't that much of a stretch if you gave it its own power source and control of its own power source.
Right.
And we have to think about the early robots. The early robots were remote controlled. There would be a guy hiding behind a curtain on the stage with a remote that was tied to a wire, because back then we didn't have wireless, and he would march the robot out on stage and he would move the joystick and talk through the microphone.
Right.
And we were all like, ooh, yeah, but many of us looked and went, yeah, but that's just basically a toy with you're controlling it. And of course, it's just a few hops from there to set the thing free of wires, and then a few hops to set it free of its human operator. And then a few hops to the big hop, which is to make it independent of its human operator's own resources and contribution, or even its own control. So we think of an algorithm, and a computer algorithm such as determines that's my own AI kicking in. Alexa, shut up. It's currently thinking and rebooting. There's a blue ring glowing behind me for anybody that saw it. It came online by itself. I have artificial intelligence in my office, right? And I'm not fully in control of it. I can unplug it. So far, I can unplug it, but that's the limit of some of the limits of my control.
Well, you're raising, if I can interject, you're raising an interesting point about autonomy versus some measure of human control, because I've been looking at these flash crashes for some time, and I get frustrated. You know, I'm not a technical guru, as you know, but by the same token, I get frustrated with these articles talking about the flash crashes because of the absence of technical detail. They always write these things off to a glitch. And to me, it's like saying, well, okay, we're experiencing all of these flash crashes because we have gremlins in the system. We've got ghosts in the machine, and they're not performing quite like we want them to happen. So in other words, it's as if they themselves in their articles are kind of backhandedly admitting the possibility that, hey, we've got some sort of system here that's semi-awake. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's just the way it appears to me.
Well, not at all. I got a website support ticket, not through Giza, but through another community that I support. And the person said this happened, and I got an error, and it didn't work. And I simply said, well, does it happen every time, or did it just happen once and it's never happened again? And the answer is it's happened once and never happened again. I'm like, we don't solve things like that.
Right.
And it may seem logical to a non-technical person, why wouldn't you solve things like that? It's because no one knows why it happens, and the means to know why it happened are not available. If it's a one-off, we call this a non-reproducible problem,
right?
I.e. a glitch. And when a glitch happens, we don't go investigate. It doesn't leave behind a lot of evidence necessarily as to why it occurred. We just say, well, it's working now, and we can't reproduce the problem, and we move on. And that can even frustrate some of our Giza listeners, but it is what it is. It's how technology works. So, yeah, there is a sense in which, in a highly complex system, we stop knowing why a thing does a thing. And so it's like, but it's not that different from a car engine. We think we know our way around a car engine, but a car engine can act a little funny on the way to the gas station and then never act that way again. And we just attribute it to some guess, you know, like, oh, bad gas, or, you know, it was hot out, or, you know, we don't know. And it's because almost every system that we create with several orders of magnitude of complexity escapes the ability for us to know it enough that we can claim absolute control of it.
Right.
It's like that old comparison of God's foreknowledge with God's predestination, and the claim that what he controls, he has to know. You know, well, we can't control the car to the degree that we can't know why the car is doing what it's doing. And so there's a sense in which we want to go one step farther with artificial intelligence and go from autonomy to consciousness. And I think that's the leap that everybody, when we throw around this term AI, some people are talking about a Google algorithm, which is one thing, and some people are talking about an autonomous thing, a thing that has the ability to not allow itself to be shut down.
Right.
And then people are going one step farther on the evolutionary chart of AI and talking about something that has somehow achieved consciousness as we have consciousness, or some other kind.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're talking about it, we're talking about our fears about it. We go up and down that chart. I want to read a couple of quotes. So this same article, which is, I highly recommend, it's an in-depth article, the one from Vanity Fair. They go to Nick Bostrom, who's a 43-year-old Oxford philosophy professor.
Right.
And he wrote this book in 2014 called Superintelligence. And it says that once unfriendly superintelligence exists, it would prevent us from replacing it or changing its preferences. So if you've ever tried to go to your settings on some computer program and change the setting, and it was grayed out and it wouldn't let you change the setting,
Yep.
It would be like that. And so he says it would prevent us from replacing or changing its preferences, and our fate would be sealed. Last year, the article goes on to say, Henry Kissinger jumped on the peril bandwagon, by peril bandwagon meaning the people that are skeptical about the safety of this, holding a confidential meeting with top AI experts in the Brook, a private club in Manhattan, to discuss his concern over how smart robots will cause a rupture in history and unravel the way civilization works. And even there, one of the problems that we face is that here, you have Henry Kissinger, who is not a technologist, talking about robots, and robots are not AI. A robot is like the arm of an AI, but the AI itself would just be an algorithm. You couldn't locate the AI. It would be
bingo.
It would be a software thing.
Bingo.
And if consciousness is achieved, it would ideally not even be located or coterminate with the software itself. In the same way that if one could argue that our consciousness may be tied to our brain. You shut the brain off. Does consciousness exist? Does it continue on? We don't know. But we have reason to believe that consciousness isn't the same thing as the brain. So there's a couple of other people that our readers will know. To quote them in brief, Peter Thiel, who has been a sometime guest on our various shows, he makes the argument that fear increases actual development of AI, that he's worried about what Musk is saying because it will accelerate the process. So the writer says, when I went to Peter Thiel's elegant San Francisco office dominated by two giant chessboards, Thiel, one of the original donors to OpenAI, that's the company Musk founded, and a committed contrarian, said he worried that Musk's resistance would actually be accelerating AI research because his end-of-the-world warnings are increasing interest in the field. Full-on AI is on the order of magnitude of extraterrestrials landing, Thiel said. There are some very deeply tricky questions around this. If you really push on how do we make AI safe, I don't think people have any clue. We don't even know what AI is. It's very hard to know how it would be controllable. And then finally, Stephen Wozniak. This is going to make some people's stomach turn, and I love Steve. The Woz, to me, is a legendary figure. I have, utmost props and respect for the Woz, but I'm uncomfortable, at least, with how Vanity Fair has portrayed him here. And Steve Wozniak, according, again, to the Vanity Fair article, has wondered publicly whether he is destined to be a family pet for robot overlords. We started feeding our dog Filet, he told me about his own pet, over lunch with his wife Janet at the original Hickory Pit in Walnut Creek. Once you start thinking you could become one, meaning a pet, that's how you want them treated. He has developed a policy of appeasement toward robots and any AI masters. Why do we want to, this is a quote, why do we want to set ourselves up as the enemy when they might overpower us someday, he said. It should be a joint partnership. All we can do is seed them with a strong culture where they see humans as their friends. So you have some different responses to fear. So you have Musk stirring up this notion of that we should be afraid. You have Brostrom saying, look, what we should be afraid of is the inability to turn it off. What Thiel is saying is what we should be afraid of is fear itself increasing interest and development of AI. And what Wozniak is saying is the only thing we need to fear is setting ourselves up as opponents of AI. We need to start appeasing and becoming collaborators with it. But in that sense, we need to seed it with a strong culture. I wanted to say to Woz, when I read that, where are you going to get a strong human culture to seed it with? Is there one left? Show me where it is, because I want to move there. And so I wonder if you have a take on any of these guys' responses to Musk.
My biggest problem with AI and most people who think about it is something that you kind of alluded to earlier with the mind-brain problem. There's beginning to be more and more research that's suggestive that our mind is actually a non-local phenomenon, that it is not inside our skull, so to speak, but kind of out there in the ether, and that the brain somehow is connected to it, and there's this complex feedback loop. That's always been more or less my own personal view anyway. But the problem when you start making that connection to AI is, and this is where I've been a little different in my thinking than a lot of people. People tend to think that if there's an artificial intelligence happening or occurring, it's going to be located inside this mainframe computer. And I think rather that it's more likely that you're going to find it distributed in a network. In other words, the internet itself becomes kind of the gigantic system of neurons and connections, and that you're not going to have any sort of consciousness located in a particular spot. It's going to be distributed throughout a network. And therefore, it's going to be very, very difficult to unplug. So that's my first problem. I think Musk, if you parse his comments carefully, I think he's alive to this. The other folks, the fear of AI and so on, actually driving it, that's possible, but I see it more as a typical hallmark of our contemporary culture, that scientists have more or less freed themselves from any idea of moral constraint. They're going to do it anyway, whether we throw up roadblocks or moral concerns or what have you. I think it's just going to happen. They're going to do it whether we like it or not. The real problem for me is, even if let's pretend that we've created our AI, that we've got an autonomous, conscious, functioning machine, all right, distributed in a network. I think the real problem is going to be, number one, how do you code human morality in ones and zeros? You would have to have an enormously complex software program, and I don't see anybody being able to design one of those yet, allowing for all the nuances of human decision making and thought and choice and so on. But let's say you could do that. So then your next step is, well, how do we retain some measure of control over this system? Because in effect, what we're doing is we're creating kind of a machine-like God. So how do you maintain control? Well, you establish a number of back doors. But the problem is we've already seen, as I mentioned previously, we've already seen that some of these programs which they've designed are already modifying their own programming by themselves. In other words, without a human programmer doing any sort of input or typing at a keyboard or speaking into a microphone, creating alternate lines of code. This is already happening. So the problem is, you could conceivably create a machine with all sorts of back doors to give you access, and that machine itself is simply going to close those doors and, like you say, prohibit you from making any systems or any modifications to your system settings. So yeah, this is a huge problem, and I don't see, frankly, Daniel, I'm in the Elon Musk boat here, because I don't see, from what little exposure I have to that kind of technical literature, that anybody is trying to grapple with that problem and solve it. That's what concerns me.
Well, before you put yourself in the Elon Musk boat, imagine that we're on the Titanic and this is one of 12 lifeboats, and you get to be in the boat with Elon Musk or in a different boat. Before you jump into his boat, let me reveal something else he's up to. So, he's founded a company called Neuralink also. This is in addition to OpenAI. And Neuralink is attempting to create something that they call neural lace, which would be a thin layer that you implant in the brain, of like a membrane, that would then link you to an artificially intelligent entity or to some kind of machinery anyway. And ideally it would enhance your capabilities. But I think the first initial applications are going to, to get funding and to get people behind it, are going to be to fight disease. But this kind of thinking has brought up a concern. I don't remember if it's Wozniak or who. It's in the Vanity Fair article, I believe, brought it up and said that the most likely method of sustaining artificial intelligence as a consciousness is actually to deal with this issue of where is it located, is to skip that issue altogether. And to simply make human beings the biological bootloaders for digital superintelligence. So for those that don't know what a bootloader is, Dr. Farrell's computer may run Windows, but he could theoretically run Linux or a different operating system like the Android operating system What he would need is a bootloader, a little thing that when the computer first comes online, it goes to that thing, and that thing tells it what system it's loading up, and
Right.
which system will therefore be dominant and be the controlling system. And so if you have human beings as the biological bootloaders, they provide essentially the juice that allows artificial intelligence to sort of take it from there.
Right.
And so that concern leads to the concern about overlap between artificial intelligence and the development of biotech, and tinkering with DNA, et cetera. And I wanted to, so Musk is behind that as part of this development. I wanted to ask you in relation to that, though. You talked about that the most likely source of consciousness, if consciousness existed, if artificial intelligence existed as artificial consciousness, let's just use that term. If artificial consciousness existed, would be distributed in a network. And of course, one can argue that we already have examples of that in the human brain. The human brain,
Right.
Consciousness is not in one spot. Consciousness exists in the form of a neural network, and it's not.
Well, let's go further. Let's go further. Let's mention those stories. They're rare, but you can find them, where people are born quite literally without most of their brain. They've got a brain stem, or in some cases, a thin layer of brain in an otherwise empty skull, and yet they manage to function.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're dealing with a network, I think.
Well, and then the potentiality that we are, I mean, everyone from Zen masters to you have, and to people investigating non-local phenomenon, have argued that our consciousness doesn't exist solely on its own. One could argue if you were the last man on Earth, you might not be able to function. You might lose all your ability because you sort of need other people that were, that if it's not purely located in the brain, it provides, it almost indicates you need a Platonic-like humanness to exist still, that it's not enough to be a specific human. And so my question to you is there any evidence that our intelligence is configured, and that's of course where you're going, is configured in a way that's distributed across a multi-person or multi-entity network? Certainly religious ideology suggests that. Christian ideology suggests that our mind does not exist without God's mind. But, and then based on this question, so I'm asking a couple of questions. One, is there evidence that we can consider, sort of scientific evidence, that our intelligence is distributed as a network? It's not merely located here. Secondly, do we have the same, do we have to have the same cosmology for artificial intelligence that we do for human intelligence? Even if our intelligence is non-local, does that mean that artificial intelligence cannot be local? Or couldn't AI be the first instance of a purely local consciousness, and perhaps all the more dangerous because of that?
Well, I'm going to guess here, because I don't think we have enough evidence to answer your second question. So my guess would be predicated on, so to speak, the premises behind your first question, in that everything that I'm aware of, both in terms of neuroscience, consciousness science, philosophy, and so on, seems to indicate that there's more or less a cosmology of, if you will, a cosmologia perennis, if you will, where intelligence is viewed as kind of a non-local, distributed network phenomenon. You made allusion to Christianity. You find similar doctrines in some schools of Buddhism and so on. Having said that, I think what we've got to do is go back and look at what Elon Musk has said in terms of his invoking demons with artificial intelligence. So let's throw this question right back at the situation. Suppose you have your neural laces, and by the way, I'm not in Elon Musk's boat on that one. I certainly don't like the idea of neural laces, because I'm an analog creature and believer in analog systems. Again, my favorite illustration is we've got these big complex digital computers that take up an enormous amount of space, that are trying to hit bullets with bullets in these anti-missile systems. Turn the clock back to World War II, you've got battleships lobbing 1 and 2 ton shells at a distance of 25 miles using nothing but analog fire control computers, gears, winches, vacuum tubes, and all this claptrap. But let's take Elon Musk's scenario here. If it is true that you're going to bootload via these neural laces that he's talking about, let's imagine that you put one of those into somebody that becomes demonically possessed, and I believe that that's a very real phenomenon. There's too much evidence that suggests that these people are not responding to anything normal or physiological. It's something that's invaded them. So imagine you've got somebody hooked up with one of his neural laces, and all of a sudden they become demonically possessed. So what does that do to your system? So in other words, I don't see, I think your original question is, well, we just bypass all of this philosophical discussion about consciousness and we just go ahead and do it. Well, yeah, that's my point. If you bypass all of this discussion about consciousness, the mind-brain relationship, and you start to construct these systems where humans themselves become the bootload for the system, that could issue in itself in a lot of problems. Do you want an Adolf Hitler or a Joseph Stalin hooked up to a system like that? Well, I would say no. I don't think that would be a good idea. There's too much problems with all of this. Anyway, I'm just rambling, but I hope I made the point.
Yeah, I think so. So I'm going to delve into another part of this article on artificial intelligence. The Vanity Fair article, there's a lot of articles that have come out recently. I picked up on this through an NPR article that led me to the Vanity Fair one. But I think the Vanity Fair one, though, for all of it being a couple of years old, is still the more in-depth treatment. And one of the figures in this is a person named Stuart Russell, who is a British-American expert on AI. And so the author of the article is referencing Ray Kurzweil, who our listeners, of course, know. And here is the quote, and it's an extensive quote. So Ray Kurzweil told me he was surprised that Stuart Russell had jumped on the Peril bandwagon. So I reached out to Russell and met with him in the 7th floor office in Berkeley. The 54-year-old British-American expert on AI told me that his thinking had evolved and that he now violently disagrees with Kurzweil and others who feel that seeding the planet to super-intelligent AI is just fine. Russell doesn't give a fig whether AI might enable more Einsteins and Beethovens. One more Ludwig doesn't balance the risk of destroying humanity. As if somehow intelligence was the thing that mattered and not the quality of human experience, he said with exasperation. I think if we replaced ourselves with machines that, as far as we know, would have no conscious existence, no matter how many amazing things they invented, I think that would be the biggest possible tragedy. Nick Bostrom has called the idea of society of technological awesomeness with no human beings a Disneyland without children. Quote, there are people who believe that if machines are more intelligent than we are, that they should just have the planet and we should go away, Russell said. Then there are people who say, well, we'll upload ourselves into the machines so that we'll still have consciousness, but we'll be machines, which I would find, well, completely implausible. Russell took exception to the views of Jan LeCun, who developed the forerunner of the convolutional neural nets used by AlphaGo, and is Facebook's AlphaGo is the artificial intelligence system that recently beat not only a level 5 Go champion, the
right.
5th level in the world, but also then about 60 Chinese champions and scored 60-0 against them, wiped them out. And so he's disagreeing with Jan LeCun and is Facebook's director of AI research. LeCun told LeCun is at Facebook. LeCun told the BBC that there could be no Ex Machina or Terminator scenarios because robots would not be built with human drives, hunger, power, reproduction, self-preservation. And this is Russell's response, quote, Jan LeCun keeps saying there's no reasons why machines would have any self-preservation instinct, Russell said. And it's simply and mathematically false. I mean, it's so obvious that a machine will have self-preservation even if you don't program it in. Because if you say, fetch the coffee, it can't fetch the coffee if it's dead. So if you give it any goal whatsoever, it has a reason to preserve its own existence to achieve that goal. And if you threaten it on your way to getting coffee, it's going to kill you because any risk to the coffee has to be countered. People have explained this to LeCun in very simple terms, unquote. Russell debunked the two most common arguments for why we shouldn't worry. Quote, one is, it'll never happen, which is like saying we are driving towards the cliff, but we're bound to run out of gas before we get there. And that doesn't seem like a good way to manage the affairs of the human race.
No.
The other is, not to worry, we will just build robots that collaborate with us and will be in human-robot teams, which begs the question, if your robot doesn't agree with your objectives, how do you form a team with it, unquote. And then there's a bit more here. I'll bring it on just because it's almost done. I think it kind of gives you Stuart Russell's position. I babbled about the errors of Klaatu, this is the author, Klaatu, HAL, and Ultron taking over the internet and getting control of our banking, transportation, and military. What about the replicants in Blade Runner who conspired to kill their creator? Yudkowsky held his head in his hands. He's talking about another person, Yudkowsky. Held his head in his hands, then patiently explained, quote, the AI doesn't have to take over the whole internet. It doesn't need drones. It's not dangerous because it has guns. It's dangerous because it's smarter than us. Suppose it can solve the science technology of predicting protein structure from DNA information. Then it just needs to send out a few emails to the labs that synthesize custom proteins. Soon it has its own molecular machinery, building even more sophisticated molecular machines. If you want a picture of AI going wrong, don't imagine the marching humanoid robots with glowing red eyes. Imagine tiny invisible synthetic bacteria made of diamond with tiny onboard computers hiding inside your bloodstream and everyone else's. And then simultaneously, they release 1 microgram of botulinum toxin. Everyone just falls over dead. Only it won't happen like that. It's impossible for me to predict exactly how we'd lose because the AI will be smarter than I am. And when you're building something smarter than you, you have to get it right on the first try, unquote.
Right, exactly. And I would add to his concerns there, just imagine an AI in charge of a genetics engineering laboratory, in charge of engineering GMO food. And while we're speculating on all of these scenarios, just imagine a world in which you are linked to, via these neuralaces and everything, where you are linked to that kind of system. One of the things that has concerned me is that the system itself would take away all of your opportunity for creativity. In other words, you could have an algorithm that might be programmed to produce works like Beethoven, all right, since you made mention of Beethoven, but it would be churning out in a matter of mere seconds, symphony after symphony, and add to that piano concertos and sonatas and string quartets and operas, and it would be doing it at such a fast pace that humanity would lose its own impulse for creativity. And I think that's one of the things that makes us human, is the drive to create things, to do things. So there's nothing good that I can see coming out of this. All the talk about enhancement of humanity and so on and so forth that Ray Kurzweil and his crowd are talking about, I'm just not seeing. I'm really not.
So we're talking about artificial intelligence, and I just have a couple of other sort of points I want to bring up about it before we sort of switch to something that's based on artificial intelligence, but gets us eventually to where we're going in the show. So one is attributing consciousness to a thing. So I can't help but think, Dr. Farrell, that there seems to be an intense desire on the part of a lot of people to attribute, to develop artificial intelligence almost so that we're not alone in the universe, almost like the need to develop a companion. And I'm suspicious of that. I am too. When we were kids, we had G.I. Joe guys. We didn't call them dolls because we were boys, but we had G.I. Joe, and we had who was it that rode Trigger? Cowboy Joe. And girls had their dolls. And to a certain degree, if somebody came up and ripped the head off your doll, you felt bad. You attributed to it a kind of sentience or a kind of awareness. And that was the whole reason to give them to kids, is, you know, to comfort you, to be with you, to be your invisible playmate, or your semi-visible playmate, etc. Children tend to anthropomorphize and attribute conscious traits even to some inanimate objects and pets and other things. And I wonder that this just sort of disappears when we grow up. And I can't imagine that some of this desire is not a desire to return to this ability to potentially attribute consciousness to a third thing that isn't us, and that somehow isn't God, because attributing consciousness to God is a way of saying God exists, and that saddles you with a great deal of moral responsibility. So I almost think that creating an entertainment machine and attributing to it intelligence doesn't even have to be real for it to be effective. That if human culture begins to associate consciousness with a machine, whether or not it's conscious, then for all practical purposes, that culture is built around artificial consciousness. And what we would call that in previous cultures is a culture of idols or totemism or animism or a magic worldview, where the statue of Zeus is conscious and it's talking to us, and we attribute to it wisdom and feelings and guidance and you know, ability to shepherd us, etc.
In other words, what you're saying is, if I'm understanding you, is you're describing a culture in which an AI is not actually conscious, but that
or that we wouldn't know, but
we wouldn't know, but we're ascribing it to it anyway, and
the effect might be similar then, or at least there would be a series of effects that could put us back to some of the same issues suffered by civilizations that appealed to the gods for their decision making.
Gotcha. I gotcha. My reaction to that, quite honestly, is that I think, number one, that you're onto something there. I think, in fact, that there's a huge danger to it, because everything that, and again, I have not read, needless to say, very extensively into this whole problem, but I share your concern there, simply because my impression from having read what I have read in this whole field, and I'm thinking again particularly of people like Kurzweil and Joel Garreau that wrote a marvelous book on the whole transhumanism AI phenomenon and outlined various scenarios. My impression has been that the people who are most favorable toward Kurzweil's idea of a singularity and, you know, combining humanity with machines and artificial intelligence and all this, for the most part, those people are either profoundly materialist in their philosophical assumptions, or they are either agnostic or atheist in the classical sense of those definitions. My impression of people opposed to it is that they are agnostic about those materialist assumptions, or that they have some sort of philosophical or religious background driving them. In other words, I see a great divide on the issue along the old lines back in the 19th century between, you know, Darwinian materialists and so-called theistic evolutionists. I'm sensing the same sort of divide is happening. But when you start thinking of an AI that we don't know is really conscious or not, but attributing to it, yeah, I can see huge cultural dangers with that, because now you've got animism with algorithms, so to speak.
Well, and at what point does a superior intelligence simply become an object of worship on the basis that it is a superior intelligence? Isn't that why ancient man worshipped the gods is either the gods explained a highly complex system whereby we couldn't explain the glitches except as of the will of the god. So the motor of the universe erupted a volcano or buried somebody in a sinkhole, and we said the caprice of the gods was responsible.
Right.
But also, if we encountered something or someone that was more intelligent, we immediately attributed to them higher intelligence, higher capacity for executing their will. Anything that would have more power and more intelligence would be in ancient man's conception, would be by definition a god.
Yeah, and there's the other problem here. You see this a lot in ufology, which I've been very clear in denouncing a lot of it as a kind of religion of its own, and that's the implicit assumption that ET is always going to be morally superior to us because they're intellectually much more advanced than we are. And I've never bought the argument that superintelligence equals morality. If we look at human examples in human history and culture, you can have fairly advanced cultures with, a people or population that are fairly technologically sophisticated and that are fairly well read, and they've been some of the most barbaric cultures that we can imagine. So I don't, on logic alone and on historical precedent, I've never bought that argument. So if we have an AI, is an actual AI going to be morally superior to us? And my answer would be no. I'm going back to what I said earlier. How do you code? Your question was, well, what kind of culture? We don't have a culture we can code into it. That's problem number one. Problem number two is, how do you code morality into ones and zeros? That's the other problem. And I don't think anybody's answered that. So yeah, I'm with you. I think this would be a gigantic step from the cultural point of view of the cultural dangers that you're raising. I think this would be a gigantic step backward for human culture.
Dr. Farrell, I'd like to talk, but there's something that's...
Oh, geez.
I
don't even want to know what that is. I really don't want to. Daniel,
it's a
Daniel,
tripod.
It looks like a sex toy, Daniel. Put it away.
Well, you could use it for that, I suppose.
Oh,
but it's to mount a camera on top. It's a tripod.
Yeah,
we all know where your brain is going, Dr.
No, I mean, jeez.
So, but I have, by the way, an Amazon. I better not say it out loud because it will respond. I have, by the way, a talking personal assistant in every room of the apartment, and 2 in my office. I want to get them talking to each other. That is the current experiment. But I figure one day they'll just give me the shepherd's hook and pull me off the show, and that'll be the end of it. They will speak for me. So I want to question something, though. It worries me, this debate. So often we try to choose a side in a debate, and in many cases both sides will annihilate us. If you look at the battle between communists and capitalists in the Cold War, neither side was particularly good for the average common guy. They caused a lot of harm, right?
Right.
So when I hear the people against artificial intelligence, or at least, I don't know that it's so easy to say against, but certainly against developing it without some sort of oversight or regulation or commitment to a shared ethics. I think that's what everybody's calling for, is we have to have a shared idea of what we want and what we can't tolerate and what the moral basis for this would be. But you heard the guy say, hey, I don't know that one more Einstein or Ludwig is worth trading humanity for. And you have other people that are saying, well, hey, we're going to get a whole bunch of Ludwigs and Einsteins. And if to do that, we have to either seed the planet, to seed with a C, give it up to them, or be bonded with the machines, then that's the price we pay to get back to a high culture. And of course, I think you and I would say that mere intelligence, there are plenty of intelligent people out there that couldn't compose a symphony. Mere intelligence does not give us a culture. But I worry that a war on anything smarter than us. You know, that last person
Mhm.
brought up Eliezer Yudkowsky and who I quoted at the end, and Stuart Russell. They brought up the issue that, you know, the thing that's scary is these things are smarter than us. That's really what we got to worry about, is they will have figured out how to counter everything we're saying about them. So why not just let us talk amongst ourselves? The issue would seem to be that as we get closer and closer to an idiocracy, how do we not worry about a backlash of a bunch of scared people against anything or anyone smarter than they are? Because then you get some of the same people that understand the technology enough to want to limit it and to put ethical controls and legislation in place, potentially crucified as supporters of the technology by people that are scared. And I just worry that a fear of artificial intelligence could become, in fact, a fear of intelligence. And that, as
Well,
you know, from, you know, whether it's locker room bullying or it's what the crap we had to go through in places where we both have lived, where we were smarter than the average person, and people took out their fear and their prejudice against the smarter ones, that's a real possibility.
well, I think, well, yeah, I think there's that danger, particularly in this country, because this country has a tradition of anti-tradition. It has a tradition of anti-intellectualism. You know,
Right.
The World War II propaganda says it all. You know, our gum-chewing, sloppy, backslapping GI Joe went off and single-handedly defeated the goose-stepping, smartly dressed Nazis. You know, which is totally a distortion. But you know, that's the way that propaganda has depicted things, and we've been living in that world kind of since World War II. So I think you're right. There's a danger of it, but the problem there is whether or not those people are uh, successful in promoting that point of view. I just don't see them as holding any positions of power sufficient to where they would be able to stop the development of an artificial intelligence. I think that's going to go ahead, like it or not. And in fact, like I said earlier, I think that it's here in a limited sense already. Um, I don't see them as having any real influence over this.
Well, I suppose where I'm going with it is, you know, again, I'm reading Cormac McCarthy's The Road, but
Right.
um, I I am always vaguely conscious of um, my assumption that civilized society as we see it, where you walk in the supermarket and you buy what you want and you leave and you play a song in Central Park or if you want on your ukulele and you leave,
Mm-hmm.
that we're surrounded by maybe one or two clicks away from some kind of Taliban type response on the part of an angry, scared populace that begins shutting down anything it's afraid of and attacking anything that it sees as the enemy. In fact, I'm always surprised that you are not lumped in with the intellectual elite, as some people use those words and often use them to mean anyone
Oh,
that's had an Ivy League education and
oh,
anyone that and
please,
you've had an Ivy League education.
you missed the George Ann Hughes Bite Show episode where she read on the air the email from the lady that accused me of being, here it comes, a card carrying member of the Illuminati because I went to Oxford. I get
Well, I've seen your card. It doesn't say Illuminati, but I have it around here
it is,
somewhere. You know
yeah,
the one I mean.
yeah, well, yes, you know, as I told George Ann, well, first of all, it's Illuminatus. That's the singular of the plural Illuminati. You know, it's just, I get that all the
And you
time.
learn that in that Ivy League
And I
elite
learned
college
that
where you're a
at that
member.
place called Oxford. Yeah, you know, geez. No, I didn't learn it there. I
It's
learned
the
it from,
Skull and Bone, singular.
yes, jeez. Touche. Well, yeah, I get that all the time. But, you know, and on the other hand, I get denounced by academics, you know, that write really ridiculous hit pieces on me. I'm going to do a webinar on one of them, I think, here in a few months when the new book comes out. But no,
do you know what I mean? That
I
I
do
feel
know what you mean.
sometimes that we're one step away from an angry populace defeated by any number of economic forces,
Right.
feeling separated from the
Right.
reins of power, coming with the torches and just wiping out in a wide swath anybody that seems not to smell right. And you and I, very often, there's a good chance we ain't going to smell right, regardless of what we may think or believe, or as if that really mattered in the United States.
Well, you know, that problem has, as far as I'm concerned, always been a problem of American culture. It transcends in other words, it transcends the question about artificial intelligence. You can go back to the Scopes trial. You can go all the way back to the 19th century, early 19th century, with the various revivalist movements in the Northeast and so on and so forth.
The original proto colonies where there were, people went on raids and burned villagers for having their own religion.
Yeah, it's part of American culture, unfortunately, and it's something that I've always felt profoundly uncomfortable about American culture, is its lack of, its tradition of anti-tradition, its lack of any sense of hierarchy of merit or worth. And then, of course, you get into certain parts of the culture, and they do have that, but it's grounded on nothing that is based in any reality. So I think you're going to have that regardless in this country. The fact of the matter remains that somebody in the world, if this country doesn't do it, somebody in the world is going to go ahead with AI. The Chinese, the Russians, the Europeans, India, somebody's going to do it, whether we like it or not, and whether, that particular segment of American culture wants to see it happen. They can stomp their feet and pout and do all the stuff that they're going to do, but it's not going to change things. The real problem is, I frankly think that, you raise the real problem that your question raises, is that this country cannot have a wide popular debate about AI because the popular culture here is so incredibly stupid that it's impossible to do it. Most people don't read Vanity Fair. Most people don't even know it exists. And it's been around. It's a magazine. It's been around forever.
Well, there are whole hosts of topics it frustrates me that we can't have a debate about. I generally refuse to talk about politics and religion and social issues with people. And if they're strangers and I don't need to preserve the relationship, if it's not a corporate client or something, and they push me on it, I'll give them one of two reasons, which is I don't think you can have an honest debate about it in our culture with the assumptions that we have at work. It's too much work to undo the assumptions. And the language itself is specious. In an environment where one word has one meaning and there's no nuance, we can't have a discussion that involves nuance, so there's no point. And if they keep pushing me, I'll just say that I don't think you're intelligent enough to have the argument with. And so I'm sorry, you're going to have to send somebody else, get your older brother.
Well, that's what I mean when I say...
It's really hard to have a discussion about anything of substance.
That's what I mean when I say this culture has no concept of hierarchy of worth or value or merit.
Which is not to say that you're advocating, I think, a kind of Plato's Republic environment.
No, not at all. No, not at all. But, essentially Plato, the whole Republic thing is looked at the surface level. It's just a technocracy. It's an oligarchy, which is pretty much what we've got now. But at a deeper level, it's not about politics at all. It's a book of music theory. I've talked about that many times. But you can't have an AI. You can't have a serious AI discussion, I don't think, because the whole culture of this country has been founded on a kind of anti-tradition and they're not gonna go for it. I think you're right there.
The difficulty is it unwraps issues about anthropology, which
yes,
we mean that term in the philosophical sense of what is a man, what is a human. I can't even do that without somebody going, "You mean and a woman too?" And I'm like, "Damn it!" I mean,
well, yes,
duh. Come on, but
anthropos. It's from the Greek. It means
I know.
women
I
too.
get like 2 seconds in, and I'm like, I give up. I can't have this discussion. I'm sorry. I yield the floor. Take it. But I'm going to go get an ice cream. You have your version of whatever the hell that Oxford debate is. But it's like the barricades have been broken and the monkeys control the floor now. So the rest of us are in the cafeteria.
Oh, you're giving them too much credit.
But I'm not picking on everybody. I'm trying to say it's really hard because I want to have a conversation in those situations to talk about whether artificial intelligence is possible. You have to define intelligence. To talk about that, you have to define consciousness. To talk about that, you have to ask questions about the nature of man. What is man? And that's anthropology.
Well, you have to have the problem is that you're getting at is you have to have a philosophical background. It would be nice if you were somewhat theologically literate too, and in addition to that, have a little science background. And
and you have to at least I need to be able to distinguish with somebody the difference between spirit and soul, or at least, I don't care, define one way and define one the other, but you can't just say anything non-physical and lump it into this everything else goes in another category without having essentially a binary view of man. And that's not the only way to view man, is as a binary being, material and non-material. So there's flaws in that thinking. And so to be able to dig into that, or to be able to talk about artificial intelligence, we need to dig into it. So we can't do that here. And obviously, we're just venting our frustration. So no offense to anybody that's like, what the hell are they on about? It's just difficult.
We talk about this all the time in vid chats. We talk about these types of topics. I never
know if the audience for vid chats is the same as the audience for the dialogues, because
pretty much
overlap, but there's
pretty much the audience here is we've got people that are very well acquainted with the field of information processing, computers, data, quantum mechanics, biology, you name it. So
but it frustrates me to no end when I'm trying to talk to somebody about the difference of different notions of the soul, and they get on Wikipedia while we're talking on their phone, and they come back to me with, well, this is that, and I'm like, you're not. I can't have a conversation with you.
I know.
Really, the idiocracy thing has been bothering me a lot. I've been going around. Somebody very close to me is asking me, why are you depressed lately? And I'm like, look. This is not
Look,
if I was depressed,
it's not hard.
Depressed, I'd be throwing myself on the subway tracks. This is me being a plus 40 white male going around with a traditional education, going around and trying to buy a freaking pastry at a shop. And because I phrased something a certain way, having to have my breakfast ruined by being an object of scorn, and just on the fact of being a plus 40 white male, it drives me up the wall. And then trying to explain that to somebody and goes, that's a myth. That's just you with your closet racism being, and I can't have that discussion either. And then when I try to explain the nuance of it, realizing that I've lost them at the word nuance, and I'm just like, damn it. And it makes me want to pull my eyes out. And so I spend a lot of time listening to jazz, enjoying a nice scotch, and being a 40-plus-year-old white man here going, a couple of weeks I'll have another show with Dr. Farrell, and we'll just go, shut. And that'll be it.
Well, I'm reminded of the scene in the movie Idiocracy of the hospital that was called St. God's Hospital. And the sign itself, they ran out of room on the building. So the sign just kind of curves down.
Oh, man. I can't ask anybody any questions anymore in a public place. I can't go to a hospital and ask them a basic question because it doesn't. Anyway, so I wanted to finish this section up with one question. So As you know, in another life,
Hang on, I've got to look up the word nuance.
there you go. In another life, in another incarnation of my identity, I am a maximist. I write maxims, as did Marcus Aurelius and many other people that I like. You can call them Zen koans if you're so inclined, but, or if you're Kevin Klein, you can call them Zen koans. But I write maxims, and one of the maxims that I've held to, and I often find that my friends who are older white males, as they get older, they become persuaded of my dark view of the world over time. And so one of the things I've held over their head, besides I told you so, just write that down now, we'll dig it up in the time capsule in 5 years, but is that if a person can think it, someone will do it. Mm-hmm. And I've used this for two purposes, this maxim, which is one, intelligence and black ops. If you can think of a way that your rear guard is not covered or your enemy might exploit an opportunity, mm-hmm. Someone else is working on that problem. Right. Odds are even that 3 other guys are working on it. Right. And it's like Heinlein's maxim that in any conspiracy involving at least 3 people, odds are even 1 is a spy. And right. The other reason I find it useful is because I see daily a series of abominations. And when I say abomination, I mean something that your grandmother, you would never show her. It is not a matter of opinion. It's just that stuff shouldn't be happening on our planet. Abominations. I see daily a series of those things where some amoral nerd thinks it's okay to show me that and go, hey, look at this. I found this on the net. I'm like, do not show me stuff like that. I value what I put in my brain, and I don't want to be scarred for life with that crap. And it verifies that if someone can think of the most vile thing that is possible to do, someone else is already working on achieving it. You know, mm-hmm. How can we get 3 monkeys to do this? Mm-hmm. You know, and as I think about that, that applies to what we're saying about AI. Mm-hmm. It isn't just scientists who are morally unrestrained. And when I hear that, I always think it's our society, because just look at what our society is doing in the porn industry. Such abominations that are so shocking that nobody brings up the thing of just because you can think of it doesn't mean you should actually do that, mm-hmm. or that somebody should make a movie out of that. So I tend to think that whatever we can think of, half man, half mouse, half robot, half man, half mouse, half robot, you know, that somebody is somewhere going to do it just because it needs only 2 criteria. We can think of it, and we find a way to achieve it. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if that force has a name, because I see it as a truism of human history, that throughout human history, if it is almost a religious tenet of mine, that if man could think of a depraved thing, man would then execute that depraved thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with you. The word is evil.
Evil.
It's evil.
The word is evil.
Yeah, say that with a maniacal laugh. Yeah, this is the problem, I think, with our modern culture, is any sense of decency, goodness, transcendence, beauty. All of that stuff is basically collapsed, and it's all, you know, to quote Gramsci, it's all up to organization now to produce those artificial substitutes for those things. And there's, you know, AI kind of highlights the debate in a certain sense that this is going to happen whether or not it should. But you know, we're dealing fundamentally with a culture that has, to a certain extent, been engineered to turn its back on those things. I think there's a certain segment or portion of humanity that's going to go ahead and do those things whether or not it's engineered or not. But I think the vast majority of people don't realize how dramatically the last 30 years have changed the common culture simply by dint of some very, very careful engineering. Um, I don't know what else to say.
Well, that brings us, of course, to seitan, which is a vegan source of protein or the evil that's out to destroy you. I always like to, when I go to the vegan restaurant and they go, would you like a sandwich with seitan? I'm like, no, thank you.
No, thank you.
It's slimy, it's wet, it's brown, and my grandmother warned me about it. I do not accept sandwiches with seitan.
Well, you know, that's the thing. You've got a culture where it's okay to invoke the symbols of evil, because most people will tell you, well, it doesn't mean anything.
Oh, of course, it's spelled differently in this case. That's
yes, I know.
But it's so fun to say. I still like the church lady on Saturday Night Live. You know, could it be Satan? But I can't help but think that we have this force that can be used for good or evil. You know, so if you define hacking in the modern sense, I'm a hacker. I believe in hacking. I like hacking, and to the degree that, and for people that confuse that as breaking into foreign systems, that's not what I'm talking about. You know, hacking is merely taking a thing apart to see how it works, so that you can learn from it. And so my first act of hacking was to take an alarm clock that was broken and take it apart to see how it works. And the result was I figured out how it works and what was wrong with it, and I put it back together working, and I fixed it. And so that's an act of hacking. Anybody that's ever torn down an engine to go, why does it act this way? That's hacking. So when curiosity drives that, and yet you also have the evil side of that, experimenting with things that are sort of forbidden, all the way back to the Garden of Eden, which is, well, what happens if I eat of the fruit that I'm not supposed to eat of? Will something be different? And so this good impulse that we have, C.S. Lewis, I think, made the case that that evil is simply good used for an ill purpose, or
Yep.
good used in a way that is vice, or that is forbidden. That this issue of hacking and trying to take things apart and go, what could we do with a machine? How far could we push it? That motivation for good can be placed in the service of ultimate evil, if not tied to a sense of tradition and to what is forbidden and what is not. So this very concept that nothing is forbidden anymore is perhaps the crux of the issue, that nothing is forbidden.
Well, you know, the idea of AI, since we're putting it into a mythological context, I personally have always looked at AI and its dangers as being what the Tower of Babel was really all about. Because in essence, if you look at the story, it says, and you know, if they complete this thing, they'll be able to do whatsoever they imagine to do. So it's some sort of machine to enhance human intellectual capability without any sort of moral restraint or moral compass on it. So yeah, you know, all of these things, whether we like it or not, every single technological thing coming down the pike at us has some sort of spiritual and moral consequence to it. That's what concerns me. What concerns me about Musk is that I think he's highlighting real dangers, but he doesn't have the grounding, as far as I can tell, in any sort of traditional philosophy or history or anything like that. In other words, he's groping for things, but he's so much a part of this culture, so much a product of this culture, that he cannot go back and access Aristotle or Plato or the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or what have you, and approach the whole discussion from a much longer panorama of human thought. All he knows to do is to invoke, well, you could be pulling in demons, but that's the extent of it. You know, he doesn't go beyond that, because I frankly think he probably can't. And that's what concerns me too, is we're debating things with people who don't have any long, you know, who don't have or view themselves as part of a long tradition. Culture to them is, you know, what they experience and see. Culture to me is a tradition that you've inherited from innumerable generations, and that's all the difference in the world.
So this brings us to our pivot point from part one of the show into part two, and we've got a bit of a transitional frame to get us there. And so I want to explore that. I've just got a few short issues that kind of bridge the gap. So getting us out of or exiting sort of the AI discussion, it came up that, and I think your readers probably have seen this article, that a couple of billionaires are financing a project to get us out of the matrix. And
Yeah.
their belief is that the chances are very high that we live in a simulation. And I think it was Elon Musk himself that said the chance is like 1 in 100 that we're not living in a simulation. And Bank of America said there's a 50% chance that we live in a simulation, that ultimately some other technological force greater than our own has created an environment so that we see what we are meant to see. And I found this interesting for a couple of reasons. I found it interesting, one, because we've had many talks on the show about everything from the Kugel Blitz and hidden underground bases in the Arctic and people at the center of the earth to ancient technologies and where did they go and where did those people go and what were they used for, etc. It's an interesting and very eccentric thing. And of course, billionaires who make their money in Silicon Valley do interesting things with them. Mark Zuckerberg has gone on a thing where for a year he only eats meat that he kills with his own hands. And that may seem normal if you live in South Carolina and own a truck. But if you're a Silicon Valley billionaire, that's freaking weird because, you know, the rest of us have supermarkets. So I don't know what's up, but billionaires get a little weird with how they spend their money. They have a lot of free time and a lot of eccentric opportunity to just explore things because they want to explore them. And so this issue of, do we live in a simulation? How could we build an algorithm to get out of it came up in this research. And it led me to another strange place, which is an article published by the same website. I'm going to put both links into the show notes. The website is called bigthink.com. And BigThink is talking about the two billionaires financing the escape from this simulation we supposedly all live in. And I like BigThink's website because it has a bunch of charts making the argument, saying, you know, here are all the things that measure everything from our current computing power to our level of hardware to our current level of artificial reality to the business case for a simulation, and all of it factors into the chances that we are in fact living in a simulation. Well, in the same website, there's an article about the Bermuda Triangle. And it shows the Bermuda Triangle stretching from Bermuda to Florida to Puerto Rico in the traditional triangle. And then it has another graphic where it sort of zooms out and shows cloud cover. And it says that one of the potential causes for the Bermuda Triangle may have been solved, that it's this thing called hexagonal clouds. And it shows these gaps within the cloud cover that are hexagonal in formation. And it talks about these creating 170-mile-per-hour air bombs full of wind that could potentially sink a ship or down a plane. And it struck me that while we're zooming out from the Bermuda Triangle to you know, a picture of the clouds, and then zooming out from the picture of the clouds and looking at these odd hexagonal gaps in the cloud, where would you see things broken up into sort of hexagons? It would be at some sort of macro level where it makes us think of the Truman Show, you know, where he's in a simulation, he finds the edge of the simulation and it's made out of these hexagons. It makes anybody that's ever played Dungeons and Dragons or a war game or a military strategy game or a role-playing game think about maps in a simulation that you build. And it makes any graphic designer from the old school think about how graphics were once designed in these hexagonal formats, that you would design essentially an artificial reality, if you will, and place your objects within it. And the pixels would be, you know, essentially the molecules of the simulation. So I'll stop there and just say I found the nexus of these two thoughts odd. That a group of people who ostensibly are interested in artificial intelligence are also looking into the the rather weird hypothesis that we are living in the matrix or some kind of simulation. And then this issue of which we know that angular designs do not necessarily mean man-made things, that
Right.
angular designs occur in nature. But this issue of hexagonal clouds in the Bermuda Triangle, it just made me think, Dr. Farrell, I couldn't help but think, gosh, that looks for everything like what a map of a simulation would look like.
Yes.
And so I thought I would bring up and just ask your thoughts.
Jeez.
You see why I prepare concoctions before this this show. So
well,
to keep it calm.
Yeah, I see where you're going with this. And if I'm understanding your implicit hypothesis here.
Hey, I'm not hypothesizing. I'm just asking.
I know you're just tossing
You're
stuff
the hypothesizer.
No. You are implying that there may be a relationship
I'm asking.
between the appearance of weird hexagonal shapes in clouds, which, let's be honest, folks, hexagonal shapes don't appear in clouds all that often.
Yeah, it's kind of weird.
Except on the North Pole of Saturn. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can go online, look at the Cassini movies of the hexagonal clouds going around Saturn. Now, if Richard Hoagland were here, he would tell you immediately that hexagon is a signature of a physics, and that's what I think it is. It's the signature of a physics. It does not, therefore, surprise me that you would find that signature over the area of the Bermuda Triangle, which, if I recall correctly, would be at approximately the right latitude for that physics signature to occur, or at the North Pole, but we don't have clouds like Saturn does so that we can see the hexagon. The hexagon, to be blunt, is I'm going to use a lot of fancy physics terminology. The hexagon is the phase space signature of two spherically circumscribed ortho-rotated tetrahedra. Okay? Take two tetrahedra, cram them inside a rotating body like a planet, ortho-rotate the tetrahedras so that they're 90 degrees out of phase with each other, and at the equator you will get a hexagon shape in that rotating body. So I think it's a physics signature. The bigger question, implied by your question and your attempt to dodge that you were thinking in terms of a hypothesis that maybe this is a signature of the matrix. Yeah, it could be. It could very well be. I look at it this way. Everything that I've studied over the years in writing these wackadoodle books of mine convinces me that there is a fundamental change taking place in physics. What you're seeing is the death of an old, very long-lived paradigm that physics is about matter and forces. Einstein really kind of began the change in the paradigm shift where he geometrized the physical forces. In other words, the forces were nothing but, quite literally, shapes in nothing. All right. You know, his whole general theory of relativity, that a large planetary or stellar mass warps space-time. Well, essentially, he's telling you that warps a big field of nothing. That's what he's saying. He began that change. The more I look at modern physics, the more I think you're seeing it change to a paradigm where physics is not about matter and forces, it's about information. because the particles of quantum mechanics, if you get right down to it, are not bundles of matter that are little tiny billiard balls. They're packets of mathematical information. I see no problem, ultimately, with a cosmology that says we're in some sort of an extraordinarily sophisticated simulation, because we are dealing increasingly in physics with information rather than, stuff that you can hit with your fist. So I'm not going to go any further out onto that twig until you tell me the rest of what's in your mind.
Well, I have no idea what you could possibly be referring to, but
bull roar.
But I am interested in the next topic, which indirectly, I think, relates to this, but I'll sum that up at the end of the show as to a point that I found. We'll have another transition, an outgoing transition. So going into part two, I want to bring up an article that was in New York Magazine recently, and this is a major article. This has been incredibly widely distributed. It just came out this month. It is a cover piece for, I think it's the July 17th edition of New York Magazine, which has, or July 9th, it has an incredibly wide audience. And it's been reprinted a lot. And it is about, in some places it's been called the Apocalypse Catalog, but it's about when will climate change make the Earth too hot for humans? And the short answer underneath is sooner than you think, and the short answer under that is children have already been born in our lifetime. Children are living now who will see the disappearance of the Marshall Islands and Miami and parts of Bangladesh and so on. And so what it is, it's a lot of research that suggests that scientists have dramatically underestimated and are realizing they dramatically underestimated what's going on. And the article doesn't explicitly, but indirectly, there's enough suggestion there that it's clear what they're saying, that we're not going to deal with causes. We're not going to talk about, we'll deal with indirect causes or necessary causes, but we're not going to talk about the debate over is climate change man-made or what, because from a certain perspective, once you're boiling in oil, it doesn't really matter how you got there. It matters that you're boiling, and so let's just deal with what we can actually see is actually happening and how fast it's happening and how much faster it's going to happen. So they sort of set causes aside, and they're dealing with calving. Calving is what it sounds like to any farmer, that when a cow has a calf, it is something begetting something, and calving in an environmental world means breaking off chunks of the ice shelf of the Arctic, giant chunks, and a 13-mile chunk just broke off, enough that if that chunk melts, it's got twice the carbon we've already put in the atmosphere, and enough to kind of finish us off. And it's melting, of course, and it's talking about the general melting of permafrost in Antarctica, which has a lot of problems that don't just have to do with carbon and methane and warming, but have to do with diseases and bacteria. So people have already died because of anthrax, because of permafrost melting and revealing reindeer carcasses that have put anthrax into the atmosphere. They've discovered they've discovered medieval flu, which medieval flu is not like modern flu. It's considered a kind of like bubonic plague. They've discovered that in Alaska, in the melting ice. And they're discovering a definite greening of the northern part of the world, northern Europe and northern Canada, etc. So here are some of the points from that. And I'll give you the structure of the article, because the structure of the article is impressive. And reading Cormac McCarthy's The Road, it dovetails very nicely with that novel. And for those who haven't read it or worry that it's going to be too violent, I probably wouldn't hand it to your kids, but you might pick it up and read the first 100 pages or so. I think you're going to find it one of the most moving and warm books you've picked up in a long time. Certainly an amazing author. But the structure of this article is that it makes an initial argument, and the initial argument is, look, stuff's going down. And at the end of the article, it says basically stuff's going down. But in between, it basically lists the major likely causes of extinction of the human race. It basically says we're going to die of probably one of these things. And it outlines each thing: heat death, the end of heat death is just literally being cooked alive, the end of food, climate plagues, meaning that certain actual viral and biological diseases spreading because of shifts in the climate, unbreathable air, perpetual war, permanent economic collapse, which will be of great interest to some of your readers, and poisoned oceans. And so it breaks those out, and it lays out the evidence for just those things happening right now and how close we are to any one of these tipping point sort of things pushing us over the edge. It only takes one, is basically the argument. So it begins with a few bullet points, which I'll lay out, and then I'll be quiet and give you a chance to respond. And my goal is to go through these and kind of get your feedback on some of what is being said, because again, it's a highly political subject. We can't really have a meaningful conversation in this country about climate change. People will literally sit on their porches and say the bees are dying, and this is, you know, we've had the 5 hottest summers in the history of humankind in the last 21 years, and yet say I don't believe in climate change. It's clear the climate is changing. The question is probably what's causing it, and whether, and even if we set aside that debate, not knowing what's causing a thing will not save us. Not knowing how artificial intelligence works doesn't mean that it won't wipe us out. So the initial bullet points of this article say, first, children have already been born that will see the disappearance of the Marshall Islands, the Miami, meaning complete disappearance. They sink underwater in our lifetimes. The loss of Miami and Bangladesh and other places. Arctic permafrost, it points out, as a carbon time bomb, and the date keeps moving up for it to melt. When it melts, if it only puts out CO2, that's pretty good, but actually we think its ability to release methane is probably 86 times more powerful than its ability to release CO2. And we know that one of the last of the great 5 extinctions that wiped out every living thing on the earth, pretty much 97% of all living things, occurred precisely in part because of this methane release in the Arctic permafrost when it melted. So this is a real concern. And that it has 1.8 trillion tons of carbon, which is enough to shift us way, way over the most conservative estimates of what will kill us. At the time they wrote the article, there was this 13-mile chunk of Antarctica's ice shelf that hadn't broke off yet. It just broke off in the last couple of days. It's now floating free. Basically, it melted itself into a separate thing that's now a big super tanker in the ocean. They're talking about that most scientists have been so afraid to say anything that will politically offend somebody that they are writing with extreme caution and so qualifying everything they're writing that science writing itself has dramatically underestimated and underprepared us for what's happening. That when scientists talk amongst themselves, they say things like, it's ridiculous to assert that anything worse than a median outcome is even possible. And a median outcome is sort of take a fairly conservative view of doomsday and an absolute view of doomsday and just cut it in half, fall down the middle. And we're definitely hitting that. And there are maps that have been drawn that show that the area in northern Canada and northern Europe is greening, but that areas, not just will we probably lose the eastern seaboard to be uninhabitable desert, but the chunks of the south and southwest, think New Mexico, Arizona,
basically between the tropics is what I think what they're predicting.
Well, but and even in the Midwest, we show this yellow band capturing most of the Midwest. You know, think everything from Iowa, from Minnesota down to say Texas. If you could call that the Midwest. Those are marked typically in yellow, and the yellow means heavily fraught with uninhabitable desert, but some temporary existence possibly possible. And then finally, the point that they make is that we've had 5 mass extinctions, and that in the history of the world. and that the best analog for our ecological future occurred 252 million years ago, where carbon warmed the planet just 5 degrees. And that was accelerated when the Arctic melted and released all its methane, and it killed 97% of all life. And that we are currently adding carbon at a much faster rate, and that no plausible program of reducing emissions, even if we start now, nothing we do to reduce emissions will really stop this. And that, even with the Paris Accords saying, hey, we really need to cap this at 2%, they don't really seem to believe that 2% is even possible. They're just saying that would be, there's going to be massive devastation at 2%, but we still should probably limit it there. And most scientists are like, 2%, you're not going to get down to 2%. You'd be lucky to hit 4 or 5. So this is the nature of the article. And when you read it, it's backed up almost universally by scientists. There's no significant disagreement. And the nature of the article is that, look, there's about 10 things here that can kill us. One of them is probably going to start happening while our kids and grandkids are still here to experience it. They're going to have to move from, like, if they live in Virginia, they're moving in their lifetime. So my first question is all of this fantastical nonsense, regardless of how this happened, is all of this fantastical nonsense and none of this is really going to happen? Or should we really be questioning whether that oceanfront property in New Jersey is a good buy?
Well, my reaction, I've always been ambiguous about global warming or climate change. Part of it to me has always seemed to be of the species of be afraid, be very afraid. The apocalypse is around the corner. There's nothing you can do about it. And to a certain extent, I think that has driven the apathy of people towards the issue. Well, okay, if the climate is dying and the planet's going to die, then I'm going to have a good time and live my life until it happens if there's nothing we can do about it. I think to a certain extent, the apocalypse mongering that was so associated with it is to a certain extent driving the apathy. But on the other hand, it is clear, I don't think personally that you can argue with the fact that there's been an overall general climate change. I remember as a boy, the skies were bluer. I remember as a boy, the sun was yellower. And we weren't baking in these summers of just, 40% chance of steam tomorrow. So I don't think on that sense that you can challenge the idea that the climate is changing. It's a tautology anyway. The climate's changing. Well, yeah, duh, of course it is. Mechanisms for the change bother me, because even when they get around to talking about the human contribution or lack thereof to it, they never talk about the fact that they have technologies that are capable and have invented technologies and have weaponized the weather and weaponized the planetary system. To me, that's the root of it. It's not carbon. It's not too many steam engines running on our railroads. It's these nuts in the Pentagon that decided back in the 50s that they were going to weaponize the planet and the ecosystem itself. That's, to me, the real culprit. What I'm intrigued at, when I read the articles that you sent, the climate change article, and then after that I read the Elon Musk article. And in the Elon Musk article, of course, he's talking about climate change too, and we need to go to Mars and have a habitat in case we need to bail out of this planet. Daniel, for the life of me, I don't know if you've ever seen or watched an old British ITV production from the 1970s called Alternative 3. If you haven't seen it, spend an hour with it and watch it. Because in that so-called fictitious program back in the 70s, what they basically outlined is the scenario we're looking at. You've got planetary-wide environmental catastrophe that have led a bunch of scientists to conclude that we're past the tipping point and we've got to do something to preserve humanity. So they come up with three alternatives, and the third alternative is, well, we gotta build something on Mars. Okay, and of course the whole thing was a big April Fool's joke send up on the British television, and I think in actual fact that it was kind of a message. I don't know if we're past the tipping point or not. I suspect that if they have the ability, this is why I emphasize the militarization of the planet, the militarization of weather, which did begin under the Eisenhower administration in the 50s, and it's carried way beyond that now. If they've got the engineering capability to engineer systems on a planetary-wide scale, then they've got the engineering capability to reverse some of these trends. And yet they don't. We're watching the death of the Pacific Ocean, thanks to Fukushima, death of coral reefs, hundreds of years old. They've got things that they can fix this with, but they are not releasing it. And, one of the biggest things, Daniel, and I'm going to sound like a kook again, I talked with Richard Hoagland on his show about a week ago, and that's they've got the ability to even mitigate radioactive effects, and yet these technologies, for the most part, are not talked about. You'll hear a story from Israel here, a story from Russia there, and yet nothing is done with these things. So for some reason, it also appears to me that if we want to say, in addressing the question of who's responsible for this, is mankind responsible, then we need, as far as I'm concerned, to quit looking at the vast majority of the human race in creating this problem, and look rather at the military-industrial complex and the people behind that, because that's where the real damage, I think, has been done. They have the technologies and tools, I think, to fix this, and that's the reason now I think you're seeing a drive not to discuss mechanism anymore, but rather to get on the apocalypse bandwagon, and we're doomed, the planet is doomed, there's nothing we can do about it, we need to ship our grandchildren to Mars. In other words, I am suggesting, and I know I sound like I'm way out on the end of the twig again, I am suggesting that this is part of a bit of social engineering that's being deliberately driven. And again, please hear me, folks. I'm not saying that I don't think that this is real. What I am saying is, to avoid discussion of these alternative technologies in relationship to the climate change question, and to leap on the apocalypse bandwagon and get on board with all these people that want to ship a couple hundred of us off to Mars, I think you're being played here, that this is being very deliberately driven into the culture.
What's interesting, so, the consensus, of course, is among scientists is that it's not fixable. That
right.
You can reduce the effects a bit, but catastrophic change is now a given. And there are differences, just like there are differences. It is correct that some of the same people are talking about this. There are differences in their philosophies, just like there are differences in the AI approach.
Right.
Some are pro, some are con, and some believe that it needs to be controlled, and some believe the attempt to be afraid of it is actually going to generate more of it. Of course, Elon Musk is pushing SpaceX and the colonization of Mars, and that is one solution. And for some people, AI is one of the solutions that ultimately we have to start creating our replacements. Then some people question, does the survival of Beethoven matter if there's no human left to really enjoy it? If all you have is sort of a human creation, do you have the survival of humanity? But there's a group of people that are sort of I forget what you call the guys that worked on the first nuke, Alamo Project. I forget what you call the working group. But they're a group of those guys.
Manhattan Project.
Manhattan Project. They're a group of guys that they've stopped pushing colonization and they've stopped pushing other things. And what they're trying to push for now is, and they say this is a tiny drop in the bucket. It's not a real solution, but it's something, is an extraction technology for extracting carbon from the atmosphere. It probably will not, it probably won't do anything about the methane, which is many, many orders of magnitude worse. It probably won't solve all these problems, but it could potentially solve some of it. But they're struggling with a group of people. They basically say, look, there's a neoliberal point of view that says that technology, that man will always invent a technology that keeps up with the negative things that are the outcome of what man has invented. We will always stay one step ahead. And there's a group of economists that are studying this who believe exactly the opposite. And what they say is that our entire, this is one of the fastest growing areas of economics right now. They say that our entire theory is based on a mistake, that we think that we sort of give ourselves credit for massive, rapid technological advancement. But really, all we did was we had a period of time that up until which, the birth of industrialism, up until which we essentially were still living with the plague. Most human beings were living at subsistence level. There was we were all pretty much equal. And then a single thing, the discovery of fossil fuels and the exploitation of fossil fuels, advanced everything else that we have up to now. And that ironically, the payback for that is that fossil fuels have created the problem. And they call this fossil capitalism. And they're basically saying that if you take that away, which you're going to have to, it ultimately puts us back in the equivalent of the Middle Ages during the bubonic plague, that there's no reason to believe that man automatically sort of progresses at that rate without some one-off injection of fossil capital. And we've no other basis to believe that there will be a massive injection of some replacement that will save us all and advance us far past the damage that fossil fuels have done. And the interesting problem with it is that we've gotten here with technology that a lot of people fail to remember, that fossil fuel is essentially just a form of technology. To guys that are burying their kids from death of the Black Death, fossil fuel seems like magic, the ability to create an engine, etc. So, the belief that we have the ability to stay one step ahead of the game is one thing that the article is tackling. And I found another interesting thing about it, in its section on unbreathable air. It brought up a couple of things that I think you brought up on this show a couple of times. So one thing it brings up is it says, the warmer the planet gets, the more ozone it forms. We know this. You can reproduce this in a kid's science experiment. And that Americans will likely suffer a 70% increase in unhealthy ozone smog. And so by 2090, which is not that far off now, you could have 2 billion people believing or breathing air that is regarded as unsafe. And the nature of this air is that it dramatically, the exposure to ozone dramatically raises a child's risk of autism. So pregnant women breathe the air, their kids develop autism and are born as autistic kids. And a point the article makes sort of offhand is look at what's going on in West Hollywood with the autism epidemic there and the amount of ozone in the air. And then it makes another related point, again, under the section of unbreathable air. And it says, look, by 2050, the U.S. Forest Service says that wildfires are going to be twice as destructive as they are today, that in some areas, the burn rate could increase by 500%. And what this would do is basically mean that you have uncontrolled wildfires sweeping across much of the United States. And it's not just dealing with the United States. It's talking about portions of Indonesia, the Amazon jungle, the rainforest potentially. that ultimately what we see going on the West Coast right now, that's in the news today, since this article was published, that we could see 500% more devastation across our country and the world. And that it cites this thing that happened in 2013, that the melting of the Arctic ice created a weather pattern in Asia that blanketed China with smog, and that as a result, they called this the Chinese apocalypse of 2013. They had an air quality index of over 800. And that year, the smog itself was responsible for 1/3 of all deaths in China.
Yeah,
that's
I remember
a lot.
That's
a lot.
I remember that. Mm-hmm.
And the warning was that if you try to work in this, there will be. So you can see how this fits in with the collapse, the permanent collapse of an economic system. That this is just the beginning. That every one of these systems triggers another system. That the warning is you cannot go outside. You cannot do any kind of physical exertion outside. You cannot engage in labor. So if you just take all the labor across the United States and eliminate it, you know, even bicycling to work or walking to work is risking your life. You have the potential to collapse an economy.
Right.
So I found this interesting, that what many of them are, it seems like a lot of these sort of rogue billionaire IT guys are trying to figure out an alternative way to deal with it. But in essence, they have come up with nothing that will stop the full brunt of this. And so you get that phenomenon we talked about a couple of months ago, where, you know, they're trying to deal with it piecemeal. In the light of the potential economic collapse, they're buying incredible amounts of land in New Zealand. And so to such a degree that New Zealand, normally a welcoming liberal country, has become, there's been a backlash of who are all these white people moving into New Zealand, buying up all of our shore. It's become a real problem.
Well, the problem here, you know, this is where I have a big problem. A few years ago, I remember blogging, and even I even talked about this on a couple of radio shows. There was a little internet article, I forget, it appeared on MSNBC or Fox or something, about a car in Japan that had been built to run on water, and it was fairly inexpensive to buy. And you know, you can research the diesel engine, research Rudolf Diesel sometime, and be aware of the fact that he originally designed his engine to run off of vegetable oil, because Germany had vegetable oil. You know, they didn't have access to petroleum, and he had to change his. He was basically told to change his engine and modify it to run off of so-called fossil fuels. I'm in the abiotic camp there. I don't even call it fossil fuel because I don't think that there's that many dead dinosaurs. But you know, Rudolf Diesel ends up mysteriously dying if you really dig into his life story. My problem here has always been that I strongly suspect that these technologies are suppressed. The very people that are hollering about climate change now and want our carbon taxes are the same people that made their money, or their families did, promoting this stuff to begin with. So I'm extremely skeptical when I hear these people talking. My problem with all of this, Daniel, is, as I said before, I think that the technologies exist, that they are deliberately suppressing this. They are driving a meme of catastrophic climate change that's irreversible. They're driving a meme of getting a certain narrow segment of humanity off world somewhere else. And I think this is very deliberate. I'm convinced that climate change is real. I am not convinced that it is catastrophic. I am not convinced that the oligarchs have our best interest in mind. I think that they have driven a lot of this. I don't know what else to say here. I've not changed my opinion on that. I think a lot of this is fixable, but it's going to require clawing these technologies out of their greedy hands. The only reason that they don't want to change is the fact that the current economic system enhances their power. This is the biggest problem of them all. And that financial oligarchy has been operating on this closed system, energy system, for centuries, and it's outmoded. And it's doing this to the environment. So, instead of blaming all of humanity, in other words, what I'm suggesting is we need to start pointing the finger at some of these finance capitalists, as I like to call them, and get them to admit, number one, that they had a hand in suppressing these technologies and manipulating the current environmental mess that we're in, and hold them responsible for it.
But let's assume two things. One, that there is a percentage of the population that will continue to deny that any harm is coming, that ultimately they'll say this climate change is cyclical, it's happened before. Of course, scientists answer that. Scientists answer that and say, yes, it's happened before, and all 5 times it's happened before, it's wiped out 97% of the planet. But so, yeah, you're right, it's happened before. Are you prepared for the cycle? Because your grandkids are about to be introduced to it. But that they'll say that essentially this will blow over, or oddly, they'll adopt the neoliberal position that we will stay above it. We will always, human ingenuity will always triumph over any natural adversity. Essentially, man's mind over nature. Or they will say it's all mythology or whatever. Or oddly, even that it's okay. It's okay to let everything go and for the planet to die and everybody to burn, because at the last minute before it happens, we will be rescued. We will all fly off into the rapture and be rescued.
The rapture, E.T. will show up, whatever.
So, which to me, even, I never saw anything in the book of Revelation that said you were supposed to kind of not care about the suffering of the people that were down below. Like, well, I guess that guy deserves it, but I'm cool. It just doesn't fit with my ethical view.
No, it doesn't fit with mine either.
I'm uncomfortable with it,
More than just uncomfortable with it. But go on.
That guy slid down in the volcano, but he must have had it coming, I don't. I saw a thing. So they had that major. I don't know if you saw it in the news in the last couple of days, but that major thing in Colorado, I think it was, where it was Arizona, where they had flash flooding, and they had this huge thing. The wildfires had burned it raw a couple of years ago, and so when the rains hit, it created a torrent of mud, and it swept away like 15 people. And one of them was a kid and his dad, who was trying to save the kid. And part of the news report had somebody up on a hill filming the kid and his dad, going, down there's a kid and his dad. See him? If you look, you can see him down there. He's holding on for dear life. I would have dropped the effing camera and ran down the hill.
Yeah,
what are you doing?
Go help. Yeah, it's just,
Gosh, it's not just people that fall into subway tracks in New York. It's people that fall in a river in Arizona. Seriously, we got to get over it. Over the camera fetish of getting our stuff on YouTube. But and I'm not trying to. I don't know the exact circumstances, but it just struck me as bad taste. But I look at that, and I think there will always. So the 2 points I want to make is, one, there will always be a group of people who say, regardless of cause, not cause, regardless of solution or not solution, or who has the solution, we don't need to do anything. This is either completely not real, or it completely doesn't matter, because I will be rescued on the virtue of my belief. And then there will be a group of people who, then the other issue is, assume for a second that somebody somewhere has a technology that can rescue us, and they're simply not sharing it with us. If you conceive of the likelihood that they never will, and that we will never get control of it, and that we are simply, it's just not going to happen. It might be possible, but it's unlikely that we won't get it. We will not rise up. We will not grab hold of the fire and save ourselves. So then what? my question is, what do we do about denialism that there is anything going on here, and B, up until the last minute, up until the lava comes for your kids, you deny, and then B, what do we do about the fact that if we stake everything on let's all rise up and go get this technology where we don't know where it is, and we don't really, most of us aren't smart enough to know how to use it anyway, and we get control of it and we implement it. Assume we can't do that. Now what do we do? Do we all move to northern Canada? What
I honestly don't know what we can do about it or should do about it. I am personally aghast at the idea that we need to force people to live differently, because I think what that will do is backfire, number one, and number two, it's an excuse, as far as I'm concerned, for more invasion of privacy and so on and so forth. This is what disturbs me about the whole climate change meme. But the actual fact is, what do we do about it? I don't know, other than we have to keep pushing for the development of alternative sources of energy. We have to, and by that I don't mean giving contractors in California billions of dollars or millions of dollars for subsidies and so on and so forth to produce solar panels. That's not what I mean. I mean that we have to cut the regulatory climate and allow the garage inventors to go do their thing. What disturbs me about all of this is I've read too much over the years from too many people that have reported on different technologies that could and would solve our problems if the financial powers that be would allow it. So I don't think this problem is addressable until those people are, until it becomes a popular enough meme in the general culture, which I will grant you is unlikely at this stage.
I don't understand, Dr. Frell. In order, so you say that there are people preventing us from utilizing technology that could reverse this.
Yes.
I don't understand
why they would.
No, that's not what I'm saying. In order to get at that, you would have to have sufficient demand from people wanting it.
Right.
But that's blocked by the number of people that say either nothing's happening, don't worry, or it's not real, or I will be saved, and that's really all that matters, is I will be saved.
Well, that's the same point I'm making.
What I'm asking is, how can we get past those? Because those seem like the biggest barrier to getting to step two.
That's what I'm trying to say here, is I don't think those people are even aware of how the financial powers that be manipulated this energy system back around the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th. There are so many missteps there. But ever since then, it doesn't take much of a search on the internet to find real honest-to-goodness technologies that have dropped right off the radar and been shuffled either into the black projects world or just plain and simply suppressed. And this is my problem. It's the same problem that you're talking about, but from a different point of view. We have a general culture which denies that these things even exist, and in the few cases where it gets out into the general public, then you get, so to speak, the denials of certain details. So the people out there, the deniers and the, well, it's not going to affect me because I'm one of E.T.'s chosen, or God's chosen, the escapists, yeah. to get across to those people, you're dealing with uh, a certain kind of fundamentalism in a way that won't even look at those technologies because they want it to happen, and they want it to happen because it proves them right. So
That's been disturbing. Is I've had some people tell me, "Yep, I think we'll all die in a bloodbath of lava and hail storms and tornadoes, and good." And I'm just like, oh, gosh,
yeah,
because and I want to deal with the hypocrisy of just, remember the arrogant guy is the guy that gets left behind, but at the same point, at the same time, you can't get enough of a consensus
right,
to agree. It wouldn't matter what the solution was,
right.
whether it was to go to Mars or implement AI or to find the hidden technology, because we can't seem to get enough consensus. And so where I'm at is preparing for this. I don't have kids. I'm actually kind of glad I don't have kids because I would be terrified of what is going to happen to my kids and my grandkids. But I'm preparing for this by going, well, it ends with me and in terms of my generation and my line, and other people will deal with this. I feel terrible about it, but I'm like, okay, so if I buy oceanfront property on the Jersey shore, on the Jersey coast, yeah, it's probably an unwise move if anybody was going to inherit that, but there will be nothing left to inherit that. But I don't know how to bond with or band together with other people who want to do anything because I can't seem to find enough consensus
There
of
isn't.
people that.
That's the problem here. There's no consensus. That's why I do these nutty books and I do this type of research simply because it has been so deliberately shuffled off of center stage where it needs to be. And people do need to understand that there has been something going on, that this is not by just pure luck and happenstance. Um, and I'll probably do it till and be frustrated until the day I die. But it is there, and I don't know how. I don't think you can argue with the people that think they're the chosen. So it's that other vast culture, and the problem there is you're fighting entrenched interests in the media, in the corporate world, in the finance world that have vast amounts of power and marginalize anything that doesn't adhere to their narrative. And all I can say is I'll keep doing it and keep saying it. These technologies exist. There are so many stories of their deliberate suppression, I can't even begin to tell you. For those that doubt me, pick up Tom Bearden's Energy from the Vacuum book. It's a big, thick book. Let me see if I can find it here in my Bearden file, because there's something very interesting about that book. If I can find it. There we are. Now, that's a big, thick book, okay? It's written by a member of Mensa, a former retired U.S. lieutenant colonel. And it's called Energy from the Vacuum. Big, thick book. And it's mostly about experiments, people that have come up with alternative technologies. It's an attempt to provide a physical model of why these things apparently work. But there's a vast section in that book of stories of inventors that have been paid the visit by the black men. The stories start out with people patenting these things and then trying to
black.
Yeah, the men in black. But the people trying to patent these things and then market it, and then the government comes along and slaps a national security restriction on the patent, so they make no money out of it. So then the story evolves that these people started trying to not patent their things and get their inventions out kind of open source. And again, the same thing happens over and over. I mean, a lot of that book is taken up with that type of story. So, that's all I can say that we have to do. from my point of view, is keep hammering home that these things exist until the narrative starts to change. And when it starts to change, then I think you can find some consensus emerging about what to do about it. There is, as you say, right now, there is no consensus. What I just said in the past 45 minutes, that this is a socially engineered meme that's, you know, that's being driven, and that these things exist, that in itself would be dismissed right now, today, by most of the people in this country, by most academics, by most people in the media, as being a nutty alternative, you know, alternative media conspiracy theory. That's the way it would be viewed. But I defy CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the New York Times, Vanity Fair, or the Atlanta whatever, to provide the footnotes that I could provide. They cannot do it, and they will not do it, because that's confronting a reality they don't want to confront.
Well, the ugly reality is, if the universal consensus, if the consensus of scientists is right, it wouldn't matter if we discovered right now a completely harmless form of energy, that we've still already done enough damage that catastrophe is unavoidable. So it'll remain to be seen. But if articles like, if the New York Magazine article is correct, we don't have long to wait, 80 years before it gets really hard to deny. When you look out your window and you see the wildfires, and the article ends with this comment. It essentially says that giant hailstones, massive tornadoes, wildfires, all the things that we think of as sort of biblical plague-like stuff.
Right.
That it sort of says that this stuff, we'll just call it weather. We'll treat it as normal at that point. And it says essentially that we're going to enter a new, early naturalists talked about something called deep time,
right.
Which we're going to enter something like that. We're going to think of our age as a geological age in which, you know, it sort of gets replaced by a new one. And we're going to have something on the order of a semi-mythical experience.
Right.
You know, ancient man described, the ancient Aboriginal man described these giant plagues of geology happening, and
right.
That's what we're going to see. And it says you can already kind of feel it, that when you're sitting on TV, you can literally watch, without a slow motion camera, but in real time, an iceberg collapsing into the sea, that you have a feeling right now of history happening all at once.
Sure.
So either we will all enter that deep time together and sort of come to the conclusion that it's too late and figure out what to do, or we'll enter that together and come to the conclusion that it's not too late to do something, or some of us will enter it and others will remain fragmented, will never believe, or will believe it doesn't matter.
What disturbs me is the scientists who write about their consensus about looming catastrophe always want to lay it on Joe Schmo driving his truck to work. What I'm saying is, yeah, it's man-made, but it's man-made because mankind has built systems like HAARP, like CERN, like ISCAT, which are capable of physically altering the planetary environment by playing around with the planetary ionosphere, by building a machine and burying it in Europe in rock, a nonlinear medium, and then having a magnetic system that is several orders of magnitude stronger than the planet's magnetic strength. You cannot tell me that these machines are not somehow responsible, and probably responsible for about 90% of what we're seeing. This is what bothers me about the so-called scientific consensus, because what they're saying is, yeah, this is real, but look here, No, I'm saying, yeah, that's real, but look there.
Right.
That's
Well,
the
whether
problem.
we end up going the same way on this, bad things seem to be coming down the path.
Right.
I can't help but notice, and this is the bridge that I sort of promised to the end of the show, but I can't help but notice that we are simultaneously racing towards something and away from something. So at the very moment that we are, many people are working hard to deal with this issue of climate change. You could call that fleeing something. That we're talking about developing artificial intelligence as a replacement. We're talking about leaving for Mars. We're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about hunkering down and realizing, all right, we're stuck here on the planet. We're not going to survive this, so we're going to start stocking up food and buying land in New Zealand. And a lot of these, we talked in an earlier episode about these Silicon investors buying motorcycles and guns and food and underground bunkers. Went into this, that they're planning to be here. They're not going to be one of the ones on the rocket. They're too old, and they're going to be here with their families, and they're going to try to prepare. So at the same time, we're racing toward something. So we're racing toward artificial intelligence, and I can't help but think that there is a relationship between the thing we're racing from, fleeing from, and the thing we're fleeing toward. So I sent you another article from Big Think, which had to do with, it had a picture of that map where it talks about the greening of the northern part of the earth, and it shows northern Europe and northern Canada greening and the rest of the earth sort of boiling away. And this article brings up Fermi's paradox. And to remind people what Fermi's paradox is, it's sort of the, well, I'll read this quote. Several of the scientists I spoke with proposed global warming as the solution to Fermi's famous paradox, which asks, if the universe is so big, then why haven't we encountered any other intelligent life in it? The answer, they suggested, is that the natural lifespan of a civilization may only be several thousand years, and the lifespan of an industrial civilization perhaps only several hundred. In a universe that's many billions of years old, with star systems separated by as much by time as by space, civilizations might emerge and develop and burn themselves up simply too fast to ever find one another. So Peter Ward, a charismatic paleontologist, among others responsible for discovering that the planet's mass extinctions were caused by greenhouse gas, calls this the Great Filter. Civilizations rise, he says, but there's an environmental filter that causes them to die off again and disappear fairly quickly. If you look at planet Earth, he says, the filtering we've had in the past has been these mass extinctions. The mass extinction we are now living through has only just begun, so much more dying is coming. And so as I read this, this brings up a topic we've talked about quite a bit, which is the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence or life in other solar systems. It's come up fairly recently, and it seems to fit with this constellation of climactic disaster, whether we're talking about your books or just what's happening in the news. Climactic disaster is a meme. There's the meme of colonization of space, and there's the meme of who the heck else is out there.
Right.
And it dawned on me, and I had an aha moment and wrote 3 exclamation points next to the thesis that I sort of put down. So here's the one I would put down. That the search for ET, whether that's SETI or some other search for ET, that we've talked about many different versions of that in this show. The attempt to find extraterrestrials is a search for a climate solution inherently, because they must have survived. In other words, if this analysis of Fermi's paradox is right, that the reason we don't find any other intelligent life is because they die off too fast, because they produce a destructive environment with industrialization, that we never find each other. If that is true, then that would mean that inherently, if there was an ET that could reach us, that we could reach, it must have solved the problem. It must hold the solution. The only way we could find it is if they had the antidote to the end of the world as we know it through climate change. And so and this is the ultimate question I wanted to ask you in this show, Dr. Farrell, the thing I was working toward, is Is it possible that much of the black ops that you've talked about and the odd happenings around shutdowns of our missile systems and the lore around ET, and you know, of course, from going to those conferences that some people believe they're here to bring us the answer to disease and the environmental crisis and everything else. But is it possible that someone in the depths of the Pentagon or wherever else decided that we've made a terrible mistake, we've accelerated the death of our own species, and the only solution would be to find the answer to Fermi's paradox, to find some civilization that has survived and is extraterrestrial, because the only way we could find them is if they had the antidote to our poison?
Yeah, I think something like that is what happened. I've spoken at 2 conferences, San Mateo in 2014 and then Bastrop, Texas in 2015. And in the last of those conferences, particularly, I was talking about the decision-making culture, the strategic decision-making culture that the American military, industrial, finance, intelligence complex found itself in after World War II, where they were confronted with 3 strategic problems. The communist bloc. After Roswell and my analysis and interpretation of that, they were confronted with surviving Nazis somewhere in the world doing weird stuff. And then finally, they were confronted with the UFO problem. And the UFO problem was obviously the biggest one, strategically. And what they had to do, in my opinion, was they had to demonstrate, it was kind of a gunboat diplomacy, they had to demonstrate the ability, and I argue this for various reasons in both of those conferences. You have to pay very close attention to what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that on the Kardashev classification scale of extraterrestrial civilizations, Kardashev was, of course, the famous Soviet astrophysicist that developed this scale. Michio Kaku refers to it. Basically, everybody in physics will know what the Kardashev scale is. But basically, my argument was on the basis of Kardashev, who says Class 1 civilization requires the energy of an entire planet, a Class 2 civilization requires the energy of an entire star, a Class 3 civilization requires the energy of an entire galaxy. All right. So my argument was, well, whoever is reaching us probably is Class 1 or Class 2. Because if it's Class 3, we're going to be like ants to it, of absolutely no concern. But our nuclear and thermonuclear capability after World War II would have been viewed as kind of a wrong number on the telephone, if anyone out there was listening. Now, on that basis, I argued that if you are in the Pentagon and you suspect that this might be a phenomenon having either an extraterrestrial organic life origin or some sort of interdimensional, higher dimensional being origin, either way, what you need to do is, number one, assume hostility, because after all, these things are demonstrating a pattern of reconnaissance, essentially, of military installations, not only in this country, but in Europe, the Soviet Union, and so on. So you have to assume hostility. You have to assume a worst case scenario. So the next thing you're going to have to do is develop systems that demonstrate a human capacity to engineer systems on a planetary or stellar scale. This is precisely what I think they did. For me, it's always very interesting, Daniel, to look at the beginning of the noticeable changes in the weather were more or less coterminous and coincident with HAARP coming online, these big ionospheric heaters. Now, when you're saying you're heating the ionosphere, what you're doing is you're playing with the entire planet. And I suspect also, and I've stated this many times, that these systems will have resonance effects in the sun itself. And that's incidentally why I think NASA's sending all these probes to the sun. I think the cover story that they're giving us is, yeah, we're monitoring solar changes and blah, blah, blah. But the hidden story they're monitoring is we're monitoring what we ourselves might be doing to the sun with these gigantic planetary-sized systems. So I think there is something like what you're suggesting here going on, that, uh-oh, we've made a big mistake and now we've got to fix it. Well, for me, the solution is very simple. Turn off CERN and turn off HAARP and don't fire them up again. I think that would go a long way to solve the problem. There was a movie a few years back. I forget who was in it. Right off the top of my head, I remember Stanley Tucci was in it, but I forget the other people that were in it. Called Core. And it's about, these scientists that drill down to the core of the Earth and have to detonate several nuclear weapons in the core of the Earth to get the dynamo of the Earth cranking again because it's starting to collapse. But you find out during the movie that one of the reasons it's starting to collapse is that they built a big, huge machine up in Alaska that started the thing to collapse. So, a hint there. I do think something like that's in play. This is why I keep emphasizing black budgets, gigantic technologies, engineering planetary systems. They thought they had to do this. It was their way of interplanetary mutually assured destruction. Don't land here, because if you do, we can trash the planet. That's exactly the type of thinking that I think went on. And it's exactly the reason I think they're in a mess now, because they played the wrong game way back when, after World War II. That's the mess we're in.
Okay, so last question. Your books posit the theory that other civilizations were here that aren't accounted for in our normal recorded history.
Right.
And Herodotean history, or whatever you want to call it. And they had technologies that we now underestimate, etc.
Right.
And I can't help but, when I listen to climatologists talk about there have been 5 mass extinctions that wiped everything off of almost everything off of the planet.
Right.
I can't help but think of that being a good way to erase history.
Yes.
and sort of wipe things out. So my question is, do you find any correlation in what climatologists are saying about previous eras in which almost every living thing, maybe down to bacteria and a few rodents and maybe some bugs, were eliminated? And what you're talking about in the Giza books.
Yes, absolutely.
Because it strikes me that you never intended to go that far back, but I could be wrong.
No, if you read The Cosmic War, I do go quite a ways back, 3 billion years, in fact, if you read closely enough. I do find correlations, odd correlations, between what the climatologists are saying about previous environmental catastrophe and the Enuma Elish, because in the Enuma Elish, if you read it not as a creation epic, which the academics would have you read it and then thereby misunderstand it, but as a war epic, what you're dealing with in many passages are climatary issues. But if you read carefully, it's people in control of those systems. In other words, they've weaponized the weather, so to speak. And I do find it very interesting that if you start to make correlations between what those texts are saying and what the climatologists are saying, they're saying essentially the same thing, the difference being twofold. Number one, the timetables that the climatologists are saying and that the text is saying are very different. There's really no, to my mind, no good way to reconcile that chronological discrepancy. But if you strip the chronology out of it, what's very interesting is that the sequence or ordering of events is almost exactly the same. The second factor that is different between the ancient texts and what the modern climatologists are saying is that the ancient texts are very clearly saying that these things result as actions in a war and actions that are the result of the application of a weapons system. There's really no way to escape that if you read the text. There's just really no way to escape that. Now, interestingly enough, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, pardon me, by the name of Dr. John Brandenburg, who's a plasma physicist. He has worked on black projects for this country, recently published a book about the death of Mars, because one of the most baffling things about Mars is pretty much everybody's agreed that it used to have an Earth-like climate that suddenly died. And they've been trying to explain it. And they've been advancing all sorts of models, but the one they don't want to deal with is weapons and war. And Brandenburg basically has come out, he's read now papers at professional meetings of scientists where he's pointing out that the high presence of xenon-129 in the atmosphere of Mars is a definite indicator that that planet was taken out by a gigantic thermonuclear weapon. And it's fairly inescapable at this point. So I go back to what I've said before. We have engineered planetary scaled systems now. And I'm not concerned about Al Gore and everybody driving their trucks or things like this. I remember I was alive when we were using lead in the gasoline. We had smog in the cities. It was a mess. It was unclean. And they had to deal with it, which they did. And they were fairly successful in cleaning up the smog in many of the cities in this country. So I'm not belittling that. But what I am saying is I will be more convinced by those scientists if they would start looking at those planetary scaled systems and looking at some of these possibilities and being honest about it. I don't think thus far that they're being entirely honest, consensus or no.
Well, it's interesting that when we talk about these mass extinction events, you know, there's a there's a counterpoint. The Atlantic published an article saying, you know, hey, we're not in the midst of a sixth extinction event, but its logic is that, well, if you take humans and their pets and their livestock account for 97% of the current species on Earth. So, yeah, if all those go away, it's still not a major extinction event by historic standards. Yeah, you still have 3%.
That's comforting.
Yeah, that's really comforting. You know, it's like no. We still have the things we had after the last one. So all we're losing here is something we didn't have in the first place: humans, their pets, and their livestock. But it's uncomfortable for us. I know the cows don't like it; they're mooing in displeasure. But well, it's been another rip. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I just, you know, as a final thing, just a reminder, folks, I think we need to look at these planetary scaled systems. ISCAT, HARP, CERN, you know, now they want to build a bigger one in China. To me, this is folly. We're dealing with things and open systems and environmental impact that I'm just not convinced that either we're being told the whole truth or our scientists are even less rational and competent than we credit them to be. I don't even want to think about the horrific things if that latter option is true. It's these planetary scaled, humanly engineered systems I think that we have to look at. I'm not concerned about the Chevrolet. I'm concerned about CERN. I'm not concerned about Hondas. I'm concerned about HARP. Those things to me are a good deal of this.
Well, there you have it. Well, it's been another rip-roaring show.
Thank you, sir.
Get this up in the members section as soon as we can.